Thank you, Sherelle. And it's so lovely to be with you all. And we're really crossing continents because I'm in London. You guys, mostly, not all, but many of you are in America. And today we're really focusing on South Africa because we're looking at William Kentridge's animations today. And of all his animations, the one that of all the different art forms he works in, sculpture, opera, drawing, he does all sorts of installation art, but the ones that are really the most South African of everything in his oeuvre are his animations. I'm going to take apart one very specific animation because I decided it was best to do one in depth rather than to try and go through a series of eight. But in order to do that, I want to give you an introduction to some of the things that I think are key to how he works and that we'll think about. And I'm talking as fast as I can because, as Sherelle said, there are a lot of slides. So, last week I used quite a bit of Kentridge in conversation with himself, that kind of Talmudic notion that underpins his series of self-portraits as a coffee pot. But I want to think of other kinds of film and also other kinds of self-portraits today. And I began to do last week to unpick that either or on the one hand and on the other, the sense of ambiguity that for 40 years has filled his work, or that both andness, the multiplicity, the polyphony, the fact that last week I talked about for him, a tree is not only a tree, it's also the tree of knowledge, it's the South African oak tree, it's the wood of his paintbrush. So we talked about that multiplicity. But the thing that comes with that sense of ambiguity and complexity is also doubt. So I want to kind of bring that in to this notion of his sense of collage. Um, he, in the interview that I talked about a lot last week, when he said he was interested in political art, he said of ambiguity and contradiction that I talked about a lot last week and uncompleted gestures. In an audio podcast he recorded, and I know Sherelle will note this down and send you the full interview afterwards. So there's an audio series called A Brush With, where they interview various artists, and there was a brush with William Kentridge. He really expanded on this idea. He said, it's about giving it the image the benefit of the doubt. And what does he mean by that? Well, he said, it's not starting with the fixed image, but starting with the impulse and seeing where that leads and what it might mean. So before I go any further into the writing, into the what the interview said, I just wanted to take that out a moment and talk from my experience. Because for me, that possibility of letting the image or the gesture speak to you is the difference between, in my artistic milieu, which is writing, it's the difference between writing a poem and writing an essay. How many of us I've tutored, but I'm sure many of you have taught children or grandchildren to write exam answers and essays for schoolwork. And the standard thing is you introduce what you're going to you say it, and then you conclude by saying what you've done. If you try that in a creative piece of work, it kills it flat. So when I'm a poet, what I want to do is have all the craft tools in my bank. I want to spend years and years developing my craft, making it muscle memory, so that whenever an impulse or an idea comes to me, I've got the resources and the tools to make the gesture that that idea, that spark of imagination requires. And that's the thing think he's talking about when he says giving the image the benefit of the doubt. It's what Keats said called negative capability, the openness, the sense that you start with the impulse and you almost let the art lead you. But he goes on much more broadly. He said it's inviting the audience to be complicit, so that whatever you end up putting on the page, you put on with an openness. So you are making meaning, but you're leaving enough white space, again, something I talked about last week, for the audience to come into that white space and help make meaning. And I'm using those terms of, the black image and the white space, the black fire and white fire, as Kentridge called it, referring to the Talmud, because we're going to be talking about black and white animations, charcoal drawings, making these black and white animations. The white space is for us. And he goes on and he talks about it a lot. The people who are reading it now can see it's about speaking a language you almost understand. You're filling in the gaps. Um, it's is my shot like when you're drawing, is this in the right position? Must I redo this and rub it out? Which version of yellow do I use? And what does he say about this? That doubt and uncertainty is an antidote to the violence inherent in certainty. So he sees many people arguing points. I think we see this in today's political world. People are polemical, strident, sure, they believe in something. And that's a value of the political world. I come from England where Margaret Thatcher very proudly said, the lady's not for turning. But he thinks that that's the disaster of the 20th century, that absolute conviction, and that for the 21st, we need the opposite. It's not demagoguery or certainty, but we need to kind of have doubt and uncertainty and openness. So that's going to be something there. The animations I'm going to show you are not arguing a position. They are making gestures that are not always certain what they are, and they're leading to something else. Each impulse leads to another impulse, but it's always leaving us as the viewer to make meaning. The next thing I want to say about Kentridge, and this doesn't, like everything I'm saying, doesn't just apply to his animation, it applies to everything he does, is that he always places himself in the picture. In the opera Orfeo, I was telling you about seeing last week, he made himself Orpheus. And in fact, the lead opera singer, the tenor who was singing Orpheus, was dressed like William Kentridge in the show. He literally places himself in the picture. He gives you the wide view, and here we've got the map. He might give you something to hold on to. We've got the horse on the map, and then there's the physical horse in front of it. This is from a series of installations he did at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park last year. And then you also get him on the horse in front of the images. This image is next to the ones I've just shown you, and you can see the multiple dimensions of it. So this is him in installations. Nothing is complete until he is in the picture. When we're thinking about the animations, I want to think about them as autobiographically layered. And I want to add a level to that because normally when we talk about him being in the picture, we talk about William Kentridge. However, I think someone else is in the picture too. In this interview he gave us, Shirat sent it out to you all last week, after his Oxford lectures. He said, my great-grandfather was a cantor, changed the name from Kantorowicz to Kentridge, and invented anglicised name. That was over 100 years ago. My Hebrew name is Chaim Yosef, someone completely other, not me at all. He's somewhere in the corner of the studio. He came up for the Oxford lecture he was talking about, but he also said, I think in a deep, profound way, he's there. So when I look at the layers of William Kentridge being in the picture, because this is my view as a Jewish viewer with the Jewish gaze, I'm also looking for Chaim Yosef. We'll talk more about that later. Why collage? So he is working in animation, but just as he works in collage on the page, and there's a kind of palimpsest of layers and things stuck together, I would say his animations are also coming from a collage process. There are different pieces collaged together, layered over each other, interweaving, evolving one from another. And he says that there are two things about collage. One is that you understand the world as fragmented, and you can either resist that or you can celebrate it. Okay. So the world that we live in is a fragmented world. And I think this goes back to the gestures he was talking about either. The polemicists resist that fragmentation. They have their one certainty. But what he wants to do is celebrate those fragments and the possibilities. And he said, so you have a ceramic jar, you drop it, it's shattered into a million pieces. You understand from entropy, the way things fail and come apart. This jar's never going to reform itself. But from those fragments, all sorts of other possibilities emerge. So that's one element about collage. Okay. The other, and this is more so about charcoal, and of course his animations all worked in charcoal. And he doesn't say that about charcoal, he says, and the erasure of it. So when he's creating the animation, he makes a mark, films it, makes another mark. Well, that's how he worked at the beginning. Now he's got a whole studio of people filming it. Sometimes it's you make a mark and you add. But often with Kentridge, he's making a mark and then he's rubbing it out and erasing it. So the more so about charcoal and the erasure of it is what he says, is that collage is understanding the world as process rather than fact. And this time it's not a tree, but a table he gives us the example. If you're drawing a table, there's the fact of the table, but you've also got the prehistory of the plank, that it was a tree, that the post history, that often this feels very relevant talking to people in California, but also for me knowing what's going on in Spain and France at the moment, that that table can go into flame, it can burn. So there's a post history of being fire, smoke, and ashes. And again, that awareness of how provisional the world is, that leads to easy destruction, I think is a very Jewish thing. But anyway, he says there's a sense that whatever you're drawing is a limited representation of what is in front of you. And animation is a way of making clear and palpable processes. So it's not the drawing the table, but it's that moving process or the table being created or the table being erased. And normally in a drawing or in a sculpture, something static, you can't always see that sense of process. And just to link it, I showed you last week the drawings for Orpheus, and sorry, for Orfeo is the name of the opera, Monteverdi's Orfeo. But you can see again these vessels, but what you saw on the screen is he's doing a static drawing here. What he did in the process of the opera is brought it to life so that the set behind him was actually an animation in which the trees and the vessels broke, burnt down, budded, came back together. Process as a part of that too. The last thing I'm going to really highlight before we get into the material a little bit more of the animations is that sense of place. So again, last week we sent you the article and we titled it from one of his quotations, "Don't forget how lucky you are to be where you are now." That Jewish sense of being an immigrant, knowing what had happened in the history of the 20th century and going, I am lucky. But it's to be where you are now. Again, last week I talked about some of those places of installations that were key. I talked about Rome and the mural he drew along the Tiber. I mentioned Lithuania and what it meant that he was working there when that's where his family had fled from. But really, the where for Kentridge always comes back to South Africa. And not just to South Africa, but much more specifically Johannesburg. He grew up in Johannesburg. He spent some holidays and summers in Cape Town. I will show you some of those places in a moment as I take you through the animation. but Johannesburg is his home to today. It was his family's home, and Johannesburg is the political centre, but is also a very, very different, has a very different feeling to, for example, Cape Town. It's both more integrated, but it's also, there's a lot more violence. There's an urban world of creativity, but also a very big sense of gatedness. And all those things play in. So his very first animated film, which became this mega award-winning series called Drawings for Projection, was Johannesburg, the second greatest city after Paris. Here he is with a drawing from it outside his family's then home in Paris. So you get the Joburg and the Paris connection. He is someone who studied. He studied to be as an actor in Paris. You'll get a bit of the Commedia dell'arte mime play in the animation I'm about to show you. Paris is the great city. We'll come back to that. It's where the l'École Juive, the Jewish school of artists at the turn of the 20th century, lived, that he draws on. But Johannesburg is the second greatest city. He goes on from this one to make a whole series of these animations. And I'm going to give you a bit of the context. So it's now, he started off doing 8. He added, just in the last few years, he's added 3 more. So we're now at 11 animated films. And almost all of them take these two, and I've called them semi-autobiographical characters. They're very different. Soho Eckstein is the industrialist. He's who we're going to see in our animation today. He's the businessman, the mine owner, that model of Jewishness. Felix Teitelbaum is the poet, and Felix Teitelbaum is in love with Soho Eckstein's wife. Felix Teitelbaum is kind of, I mean, I'm using words that don't quite fit here, but if you imagine he's the bohemian and the Bundist. So if we were going to talk about Jewish stereotypes, we have 2 extremes, but both of them, I would say, are versions of Kentridge or Chaim Yosef. And I'm going to prove it a little bit later as I go into Soho Eckstein. But what I want to do is show you this quote. So the Board of Deputies in South Africa hated Eckstein, and the Board of Deputies in the UK picked that up. So Eckstein is deliberately often gross and callous, not quite in the animation I'm going to show you, although you're going to get something else about him. But the Board of Deputies in South Africa and then the Board of Deputies in London decided that this made Kentridge's work anti-Semitic. Okay, so in 1999, we got some of the films showing at London's Serpentine Gallery, and there were all sorts of things in the press. Judy Hecker, a curator from MoMA, got interviewed about it, and she said it was accidental. But then this is the same person who said his work was all about the Holocaust. She says he didn't intentionally seek out Jewish names. Ashkenazi names were just part of the world the artist grew up in. In other words, he used what was familiar. So I think that's a yes and a no. He does use content from his Ashkenazi, Litvak specifically, Jewish South African upbringing. But I think he is also deliberately thinking about what is the role of the Jew in society. So I'm not sure about that the names are accidental. As I unpick this, you're beginning to understand why I think he always deliberately layers Jewishness in. And I'm going to pick up a couple of other things. So this accusation of anti-Semitism came up a lot around the nose. So one of the things for Teitelbaum and Soho Eckstein is they have what could be called Jewish noses. The nose is actually playing off the goggle story, But he's obviously, again, this isn't accidental. He's following, so the story, the Gogol story, is a Soviet officer whose nose falls off, and then the nose goes above him up the bureaucratic ladder. It's very absurdist. You'll find that Kentridge often not only draws on the French Jewish artists, but he draws on the Russian absurdist kind of movement. But when he was interviewed, he said that actually, when he did this opera, this wasn't meant to be anti-Semitic. It was his own nose. The shape of the nose is my nose, an Ashkenazi Jewish nose. And this is from an interview in the New Yorker with Calvin Tompkins. And Tompkins writes in the New Yorker article that William Kentridge said that while beaming. And here is, sorry, here is, you can see he actually gave me a copy of the book of work he did with the nose to go with it, alongside, actually, let me just go back for a second if I can. Hold on. Oh, no, let me just go back. There we go. I just wanted to point out in the background the other book he gave me, and he said I was the first person who'd ever come to talk to him specifically about the Jewish dimension, and that's why. That's the background. That's Triumphs and Laments. That's the book that he did to go with the Rome project. So you can see that there is a very much an awareness of the Jewishness, and on the one hand, there is this championing Jewish history, going right back to Josephus. And on the other hand, there's this awareness of stereotypes that are used in the modern world. Anyway, in this Calvin Tompkins article in the New Yorker, he points out about the nose and who the Jew is. You know, he uses the two characters to enact the predicament of the Jew who's successful and wealthy, Eckstein, and the Jew who is the outsider, Teitelbaum. And then this is what he says. It's not just me. Both figures, however, bear a strong resemblance to Kentridge, portly and bald with a large-nosed and hunched shoulders. The artist even said that each represents aspect of himself. With that in mind, it's possible to view them as paradigms of Jewish life in South Africa more particularly. On the one hand, many Jewish South Africans were liberal idealists who fought to end apartheid, Kentridge and his family among them. And I told you last week, Sidney Kentridge was Nelson Mandela's lawyer. But the Jews of South Africa also benefited from the racial hierarchy that privileged skin colour above all else. And the Jews, I mean, this is like, I'm sure this is something that many people who've spoken at CSP have unpicked over the years. What is it? Are Jews white or not? But in South Africa, that whiteness put them above the Black community in this world of apartheid. And it says, and he gives an interview where he says the story of Barney Bernardo, you know, would never have been possible if he were Black. So when it gets picked out, they make that comment. So Barney Bernardo founded De Beers Diamond Company. Couldn't have happened if he was Black rather than Jewish. And this article, which analyzes Kentridge, goes, well, Kentridge couldn't have been famous and he wouldn't have had the rise if he hadn't had the benefit of being white, wealthy, university educated, etc. And Kentridge himself is really aware of this paradox. So I've put here a little interview he gave with Bell Hooks. The lack of capitalization is deliberate, that he feels he can't champion Black rights without acknowledging the privileged status he inherited at their expense. There were always prominent Jewish people in the anti-apartheid movement, he told Hooks, and this is in an exchange published in Interview magazine. But a central irony exists for South African Jews. Our Passover ceremony every year commemorates the Jews as slaves in Egypt. And there was always an understanding that here we are in South Africa talking about having been slaves in Egypt, yet in the present we're certainly not slaves. He went on, in the present we're not part of those most oppressed. We're part of the privileged whose lives are made comfortable by an immediate sense of the society we're living in. That remains an uncomfortable irony to live with. So in the film that I'm going to show you, there's a lot of affection for the Soho Epstein figure. But towards the end, there is also this sense that there is a grounding within a world where South African Black people have other kinds of problems. There are many other of his animated films which really focus on that. So the films about mining, for example, there is one explicitly called Mine, really goes into the treatment of the black slaves in the mining industry, and some of those mines were owned by Jews. So there are complications, and there is a sense of a political awareness. But as I said, it's not polemical. It's like, how do you hold the uncomfortable irony? And I just wanted to show you briefly, I won't go into it in depth, but he's been invited to do things about Egypt. And what always made me laugh, and I mentioned this to him, that the Egyptian notebooks piece that he did in France with Philip Miller, who I mentioned last week, um, you can hear, he did this exhibition with the Louvre, it was at the Jeu de Paume. And what they do, they name every influence he's working with. And they say he mixes different references, Shelley, Hegel, Napoleon, Verdi's Aida, the Sphinx. The one thing that they don't say, and he himself said this to me and laughed at it, is why is he obsessed with Egypt and slavery? Because of that awareness of the Pesach story. So we're going to be a bit more aware than most people who look at Kentridge work, but it's always there in the background. So I wanted to give you the sense of place. I wanted to make you aware of what the arguments are about his anti-Semitism. But I also want to say to you, for me, it's about how you look. And if you look, this is a complicated Jewish artist. That should, and I was just checking my time, it has taken me almost exactly half an hour. So for the last 20 minutes, I want to give you time to questions. What I want to do is take one of the animations apart. So let's move on and look at it. So this is one of the drawings for Tide Table. I picked Tide Table because this is the one people say is really Jewish. Why? Because there's a still of a woman with a Magen David on her back. Hilariously, I do think it's a very Jewish animation, but this is almost the least of it. We'll come back to her in a moment and who she is. It's much more complicated. It's not that this woman is Christian and this is Jewish. It's a much more complicated idea of symbols. But just to say, that's why I've chosen Tide Table. And that's the one that you will get curators referring to when they write about him as the Jewish one of his animations, but for completely the wrong reasons. Okay, let's watch it. Okay. So I actually believe that it deserves watching many, many times to begin to get a grasp of it. If I time this right, we will watch it again towards the end. But I'm not going to try and explain it. I'm not going to try and give a right answer. But what I do want to do is take apart pieces of the collage and show you how it was made. So let's start with the figure. This is the Soho ex-Gene businessman figure. And he's sitting on the beach, so having his holiday, but he's reading the newspaper. And I think a lot of the approaches to this go, well, this is showing he can't even relax, even in beautiful nature. He's obsessed by, work and industrialism. But I think something else is happening too. And this is why I'm saying that they're semi-autobiographical. Because this man reading his newspaper in his pinstripe suit, sitting on the deck chair, it's not just taken from Kentridge, but it's taken from his grandfather. So last week I talked to you about Maurice Kentridge, the Sidney Kentridge's father, who was the MP Labour lawyer, fought against the Aliens Act bills stopping immigration of the Jews. And here he is on the beach with his son, Sidney Kentridge, who's, you can see, serving in uniform at the time. And here they both are on the beach, and in fact on Muizenberg Beach, which I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. And here is Maurice Kentridge in his three-piece suit. So this is actually a hugely autobiographical image. And one thing Kentridge was aware from when he was very young is that if you look at the shape of his face, it's squarer. His father was long and narrow, but he is very much his grandfather. He's small, he's got this square-shaped face, and he sees himself in his grandfather. Here is an image he did of his grandfather sitting on Muizenberg Beach with Kentridge and his brothers at his feet. And I'm just going to play you a tiny clip because David Krut talks to us. The printer I told you about, who let me take this photograph, told me about this as one of two images. So you get the political and the personal side by side. Let's just play it.
With William, and I've been collaborating with William since 1992. And we developed a workshop in Johannesburg in 2002, and William started bringing through old plates that he might have had and never editioned. And he found two lino-cut works from his days as a student. And it was interesting, this one over here, it's about Cecil John Rhodes and the Jameson Raid. And what it was, he had to do an essay. I can't remember, he told me what the content was. But he felt it might be a bit short. He was submitting it. So what he did was, as a cover, he created this image of Rhodes and this group of other people involved. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if at the same time, though, he did the same image, which is Muizenberg 1933 reversed, depicting his father with his grandfather sitting in Muizenberg Beach. And like my own father, he used to go to the beach wearing a suit. Mm-hmm. And that's what the gentleman, and there's also these old these sun deck chairs, which are still there. And so he did this as well. So this is, Muizenberg had all the kosher hotels. Yeah. And so that's how that came about. But that's these are interesting stories about these two images, which in fact he did in, I think, I can't remember the original year. This would have been 1985 or something. I can give you the detail on that. Mm. But we did, so they'd never really seen the light of day, and we did an edition, which is an impression in 2019.
So you can hear that in 1985, thought it was, Kentridge is a student right back at the beginning of his career. On the one hand, he was doing Cecil Rhodes and thinking about the political world. And on the other, he was drawing his grandfather. Apologies, it's not William Kentridge sitting at his feet with his brothers. It's Sidney Kentridge, the father. So that idea of the political and the personal have always been side by side. But Soho Eckstein on the beach is clearly his grandfather. The pinstripe suit, there's an interview where he's asked about his relationship to the mundane and how he uses coffee pots and telephones and pinstripe suits. And he replies and he says, there's a sense of objects I have as a kind of family portrait. I'm not sure which vessel I am. The pinstripe suit partly stems from the absurdity of a photo of my grandfather in 1928 sitting on a beach in a deck chair with his three-piece suit on, his Homburg hat, and his socks and shoes. And you can see then, this is from Hauser and Wirth's catalogue, Kentridge's character of Soho Eckstein, the mining magnate, always wears a pinstripe suit. So, yes, it's Soho Eckstein, but it's also his grandfather. That newspaper he's reading, he really did read, but it grows and it engulfs him. And let's look at a couple of the images that come up as we get a close-up view. So can you see down here? Okay. People go, these are just random marks, but it's not, because that's how he draws a menorah. Not just any menorah, but this is from the Triumphs and Laments series in Rome, the menorah that the Romans are taking from the Jews. Tide table is one of the other things. This is the title of the animation, but it comes from the table of the tide that's shown in the newspaper. And alongside it is music. You can see the musical instrument, musical notation down the side. You get this movement of the tides, also the movement of music. And this combination of land and sea and movement and music goes back to that migrant tapestry I showed you last week, which is about the black slave narrative. But you can see on the boat a grand piano as well, because his story of Lithuanian immigration was also a bringing of music from Lithuania to South Africa. And then we get the cows on the beach. So absolutely, I don't know if anyone here has been to the South African beaches, but you really, really do get South African cows on the beach. But if you count them, 1, 2, 3, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 cows. And this again is very deliberate. I asked him and it's a reference to the Bible, to Joseph's dream and the 7 cows, the fat cows and the thin cows, which I'll come back to in a minute. There's a little boy on the beach, and next to him is the woman you saw who later we see with a Magen David on her back. These are her feet here, and the edge of it looks a little bit like a talit. Okay. Why the Magen David on her back? She's a nanny to a Jewish family. So what inspired this animation? William Kentridge went to Muizenberg. He went back to where he'd had his childhood family holidays, sat on the beach. Muizenberg Beach is not far from Cape Town. And while he was on the beach looking out, he sees the woman who was the old nanny, but is part of a Christian church, taking part in a baptism ceremony in the sea. So all those women with symbols on the back, the symbols are not who they are, but it's who they belong to, who they work for. And again, the little boy is the young Soho Eckstein, but it's also the young Kentridge. What is the little boy doing? He's making a sandcastle, but he's sculpting. So here's the woman who's the nanny. Here's Soho asleep. And while Soho's asleep, the little boy, there's the baptism ceremony. You can see the cows beyond it. This is all happening at the same time. Here she is watching as someone goes into the sea. And who is at her feet? The little boy she's meant to be looking after. And in reality, this is Kentridge imagining back to his own childhood. And that's quite a sandcastle he's making. I don't know if you can see the shape of it, but you will in a moment. Do you remember in David Critz saying the kosher people went to Musenberg Beach because that's where the kosher hotels were? This was one of the kosher hotels, the Balmoral. Now, here we go. It's got a parade of very unappetizing shops, but you can see there is the little boy creating the scan sculpture. Here is the kosher hotel. Um, but it's complicated, and I'll go back to that in a minute because but there are other buildings on the beach. The other buildings on the beach are the beach huts, and again, these are real. Here they are in 2025. They've been updated a bit now, but apparently they were always coloured, although Kentridge washes them out in his black and white. But this is absolutely the beach. Like this is all a very, very real scene. Um, Parallel to the hotel, there is something happening inside the beach hut. Um, and it starts with a light. You see a light bulb casting light, and something will appear. So here we are in a South African beach. We've just seen a little boy creating or sculpting. We go inside the beach hut. You know, this is the little boy's world, his area on the beach hut, and it's a light bulb. You know, maybe not now. They're very posh, those beach huts now. Maybe it's true that there was a hanging light bulb, but I wonder if there's something more going on because one of the people that Kentridge often looks to is an artist called Philip Guston, a Jewish artist who um, born in Eastern Europe, moved to America, lost family in the Holocaust, had a brother who died, a father who didn't treat him very well because of post-traumatic stress. Guston did constant self-portraits. He used cadmium red because it was the color of salami, he joked, you know, very, very American. And he always had a light bulb in his work. And again, that's a whole other story if you want me to do Philip Guston sometime. But that's a bigger story. But that he has symbols like Kentridge has symbols that build into his work. And there are a few things that make me think this is a Guston light bulb. So one of the things about Guston was that he could paint like an old master. So what you've got on one side is Max Ernst. So Max Ernst, husband of Peggy Guggenheim, communist, imprisoned with most of the Jews in Camp d'Amelia in the south of France, and then got out by Eleanor Roosevelt and Marion Fry. He became an abstract artist. He supported modern abstract artists, but he trained painting like Tiepolo. And this is Philip Guston himself painting like Tiepolo or Max Ernst on a mural. But Guston got politicized. So on this side, we have a Guston original, very, very early work, influenced by Tiepolo. And then what happened was he saw a Ku Klux Klan lynching. And he spent the rest of his life doing cartoon style drawings. This was the first, and this was more realist. To the point, this is a Guston self-portrait. He was asking himself as if, as a white Jew, he was complicit. So he's painting a self-portrait and painting himself with a Ku Klux Klan hood. Okay, very, very complicated. But I think the whole series of Kentridge's animations are asking the same questions. It's not saying, as Jews, we are like the Ku Klux Klan. It's saying, What do we as Jews do with power? How do we treat the other? And again, just to say, there's the Tiepolo, Di Carico. These were big influences of Augustine, who are also, by the way, influences of Kentridge, and you get the light bulb. That light bulb casts light onto one of the cows, but a cow is not just a cow, right? Or even it's got the horns. It's not just a bull. Freud's a cigar is not just a cigar. Kentridge, a tree is not just a tree. I think that cow, and again, I did ask him, is a bull, is coming and commenting on Picasso's 11 developments of a bull. This is a series of lithographs. The bull represents Europe, Europa. This is one of the lithograph series alongside a painting of the charnel house, post-Holocaust, about the breakdown of Europe into abstraction. Like Guston, like Max Ernst, starting with the learning the skills of an old master in craft, ending in utter abstraction. But there's a Jewish element too. And I'm going to take about 3 minutes more and then show you the film again, because I know you want some questions. But there's a few key images I want you to see. That light bulb comes and hangs the bull upside down, hangs the cow upside down. This is one of the images. Again, this is a reference to Chaim Soutine, the carcass of beef. And when I asked Kentridge about it, he said Soutine, of all of them, was by far the one who influenced him the most. And you can see, so this is Soutine. He said you can see in Soutine the poor man, the man who looked at the side of flesh as if it was human. Some artists look at people, they draw nudes like they're pieces of meat. Soutine draws a piece of meat as if it is a living, breathing human. And he said to me, we talked about La Ruche, where Soutine's studio was, with all those other Jewish artists, Chagall, Modigliani. I went there. This is my version of that photograph. This is the model of it. This is Soutine's studio next door to Chagall's. And something Kentridge told me, which I hadn't known, even though I've been there, is think about the smell, he said. Soutine was critiqued by all other artists of his realism. This was the days before freezers and refrigerators. He hung the carcass, he painted from life, blood seeped under the door. It stank. Every other artist had a problem with it. But for Soutine, that it was like the flesh and blood of reality was part of his process. And you can see, here's the slaughtered ox. This is from Rembrandt. What Kentridge said to me is people always say, you're doing this image from Rembrandt, but no, it's Soutine who's versioning Rembrandt and Kentridge versioning Soutine. Inside it is the deck chair. I won't play with that. There isn't time. But that French Commedia dell'arte thing. But more importantly, it's the ribs. 7 cows, fat and thin. The thin, the famine. He didn't want us to forget the famine and the illness in South Africa. So that deck chair becomes a bed, and we get the AIDS crisis because there is apartheid, but there is also terrible, terrible sickness in South Africa. And at the end of the animation, we get the Pietà, based on Michelangelo. And what I want to do is play with you one more time, because I just want to finish with the soundscape.
izwi banongoma ezabazama bazama urazulu natali sayikhona ememeze umkhosi etina
So I'm going to finish with two things because I know you want to ask some questions. Oh, it's going the wrong way, isn't it? Here we go. Um, the Pietas are not just Christian, they're Jewish. Mike Chagall, you know, I said we have, what, sorry, Mark Chagall's White Crucifixion. Chagall lived in the studio next to Soutine. You know, he has both and. There's Jacob Epstein, there's all sorts of others. But I wanted you to listen to the soundscape done by Philip Miller using South African songs and spirituals. And in that spiritual, he uses the line, Eloi, Eloi, and you probably heard it, Lama Sabachthani. And in Mark, in the Christian Bible, my God, why have you forsaken me? But as Kentridge pointed out to me, that's a translation of a line from a Jewish Hebrew psalm, Eli, Eli, Ama Azavtani. You know, it's a mistranslation. So I just want to point out the gap, how easy it is to take something from your own language to another person's and cultures. And go back to the white fire, the black fire, words of white spaces, it's for our own interpretation, but it also that process, right? That's what I'm showing you today. A line becomes a drawing becomes a shadow gains the heft, gain the weight of a paperweight. You know, this is to create that. Can you imagine one brush stroke at a time? That's years and years and years of work. It is the exact opposite of everything else where he draws fast. This is a process, and it's a process that believes the words of prayer for God and the gaps between the words offer us. Thank you very much.
Aviva, thank you so much. We're almost at time, but I'll kind of jump into a few questions. One quick one: the bulb and the bull also, are they reminiscent of Chad Gadya, which they both appear in?
I'm not sure. The light bulb is used by Philip Guston because there's a very difficult story from his childhood about being locked into a cupboard and the bare light bulb was the real only thing. But having said that, the Khadgadzija, the other Seder themes, do creep in other places. So maybe that's something for another time. But I think behind, having said that, I don't want to dismiss it altogether because I think that's the whole thing of this work, right? Khadgadzija is the process of one thing consumes the other. And it is that movement from one to the next to the next and that sense of entropy. So in many, many ways, it is aesthetically very Kentridge.
Okay. Another question is, you mentioned quite a lot about how Kentridge's Jewishness was accepted or denied within the artistic community. Do you know, or can you say something about if and how he's accepted within the Jewish South African community?
So I actually can, but I want to be very careful because, again, it's not my story to tell, it's his, but I'll tell you my experience. So I lectured on him. So I met him in his studio, and part of the reason he let me in is because I'd been invited by South Africa Limud to do a series of lectures in Johannesburg, Durban, and Cape Town. on all sorts of Jewish arts and culture topics. But whenever I travel around the world, I try and do something that links locally. So if I come to you for your study day, your study weekend in February, I think next year, I will try and link somehow to California and Los Angeles. So that's when I said I do Kentridge. And that point, I was really a literary scholar who loved visual culture because I spent 13 years of my life working in museums and galleries just to pay the bills while I studied. That's what I did to fund my PhD and other things. But they said to me, I said, okay, let's look at Kentridge. Had connections, spoke to Liza Esser, who is his gallerist. She knew of from other people of work I'd done on him for the magazine. So I got this entree and then I went and did these lectures. And then when I came back to I'd say London, to the UK, almost immediately afterwards, there was this exhibition in Yorkshire, and I was invited to go and give a subscriber lecture there on his work. So South African radio phoned me while I was on the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and I did a South African Jewish radio interview. Okay. So what I want to say is Cape Town, Durban, Johannesburg, almost every member of the audience, when we own a Kentridge, you know, most of them from when he was like a junior artist. In Joburg, there was lots of, he's a member of my Reform Shul, doesn't come very often, but we see him on High Holy Days. Oh, and I was at his son's bar mitzvah. Then there was this whole other strain of, oh, is he anti-Semitic though, the way he critiques some people like the mining trade, because a lot of people work for the mining families. And then there was this kind of wider question that kept coming up about Israel, which I don't really want to go into now. Maybe he will do it next week, but that became a question. So throughout Durban, Cape Town, Johannesburg, so you could not get three more different South African Jewish communities. There was a feeling of he's ours. And the minute I showed them Muizenberg Beach, they all knew it. They were like, what is this woman with this accent doing talking to us about Muizenberg? What chutzpah? So he was like, this was the Jewish South African world. And they picked up references that the art critics and curators internationally never would. So then I did the interview for South Africa Radio, and the presenter was convinced that, like, why was I doing this? Because Kentridge wasn't really Jewish. No one ever talks about him as a Jewish artist. What are you doing with a sculpture park exhibition in Yorkshire, you know, doing a thing on him as a Jewish artist when no one in South Africa ever talks about him being Jewish? So it was this funny thing, like, and I think that image of him, you know, the Jewish community knew he was one of theirs, but the wider world never talked about him as an artist. Like, that was the thing he was trying to refute when, in that series of interviews for his 70th birthday, he starts throwing Jewish references in. So very interesting and complicated.
Amazing. Aviva, thank you so much.
Thank you. So lovely for you to have me, and looking forward to next week.